So today's session, Designing Community Action for the 21st Century, is brought to you by the Canadian Community Economic Development Network. We're a national network of several hundred community organizations and individuals working to create local economic opportunities that support an inclusive and sustainable economy. Here you can see a few of our member logos, and here's an image of our website member map, which is a new addition in the last year. You can find members close to you on the map, located at the web address listed at the bottom of the screen. If you like the session today, consider joining us by becoming a member or signing up for our free e-newsletters and following us on social media. CCEDNet's done a number of webinars like this in recent years. Here you can see some of the topics that we've covered. All of these are on our website and free for members. Allow me to welcome you again. There you can see a photo of me. Today's webinar is going to be divided into two parts. To start, we'll have a presentation by David that will last about 25 minutes. Then in the second part, I'll ask him the questions that you've posted in the chat box. Once again, you should feel free to ask those questions, post the comments, or any other information you'd like to share in the chat box at any time. Just before we get into the presentation, it's fun to get a better sense of the people who are on the webinar together here. So you should see two quick polls pop up on your screen. The first one, this is a real skill testing question here. How familiar are you with group selection or multi-level selection within evolutionary theory? I know we do have one postdoc on the call here who might have some evidence or some familiar with these terms. I have to say I wasn't very familiar with them before hearing about David. The second question, how familiar are you with the work of Elinor Ostrom and the core design principles for cooperation in groups? So we'll hear more about Ellen in a second. So while you answer those polls, let me introduce the session. I'm very happy to have Professor David Sloan Wilson with us, an evolutionary biologist who's been outspoken in arguing the merits of group selection. That's the evolutionary theory that groups can be viewed to have functional organization in much the same way as individuals do. In other words, evolution is not based merely on selfish survival, but includes cooperation among individuals in a group context. This insight has profound implications for community development strategies. Working with Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics a few years ago, and her colleagues, David helped generalize the design principles of cooperation in successful groups and has now been looking at how they can inform a wide range of community initiatives. Through experiments with new approaches to sustainable community development, including the Binghamton Neighbourhood Project and the Binghamton Regional Sustainability Coalition, David's part of a team that has recently developed PROSOCIAL, a free online platform that helps groups apply these core design principles in order to improve their efficacy in working together towards common goals. So this session will focus on how to improve the design of your community development project in ways that will increase its impact. Just before I hand things over to David, let's have a look back at the poll results. We can see actually there's one person who's very familiar. That might be David, but maybe not.
No, I didn't answer the poll.
That wasn't you. Okay, so that's great. Someone who's very familiar with multi-level selection and evolutionary theory. A few people that are somewhat, and a number of people that never heard of these terms. So it's good range here today. And familiar with the work of Elinor Ostrom. A few people who've never heard of Elinor, and some few people that are somewhat familiar. I'm probably in the somewhat familiar range, just recognize her picture and the basics of her prize-winning work. But, oh, Alan picked out the very familiar. Excellent. So great to have an expert on the call. All right, so now it's my pleasure to introduce David. David is a State University of New York Distinguished Professor teaching the Departments of Biology and Anthropology at Binghamton University. David is an evolutionist who studies all aspects of humanity in addition to the biological world. He manages a number of programs designed to expand the influence of evolutionary theory in higher education, public policy, community-based research, and religion. David communicates to the general public through his Science Blogs site and his trade books, including Evolution for Everyone, How Darwin's Theory Can Change the Way We Think About Our Lives, and the Neighborhood Project, Using Evolution to Improve My City One Block at a Time. His most recent book is Does Altruism Exist? Culture, Genes, and the Welfare of Others. So welcome, David, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, and hello, everyone. I want to welcome Alan Honeck, who's a member of my pro-social development team, who is joining me in the chat area. So let's launch right into it. See if I can use these buttons. Let's see. Okay, good. Just a little bit about my background. This might seem strange that a biologist like me is conducting a seminar like this. So I'm trained as an evolutionary biologist. I've spent many years studying the birds and the bees. But I also study evolution in relation to human affairs, and it's important to stress that evolution includes cultural evolution, not just genetic evolution, so that most of the fast-paced changes that are taking place all around us, which we don't necessarily associate with evolution, are in fact forms of evolution. And that's what makes Darwin's theory so important for us all to know about it. I helped to create an institute called the Evolution Institute, which is a think tank that formulates public policy from an evolutionary perspective. And it's thanks to the Evolution Institute that I'm able to develop projects such as the one that I'm about to describe. And in all of the work that I do on both humans and non-humans, there's a overarching question that we need to ask about social behavior, which makes altruism and cooperation and communitarian efforts of all sorts a bit of a puzzle, which is that natural selection favors traits that increase the survival of and reproduction of individuals. That's me doing better than you. And so how can natural selection favor the traits that cause us to do well as a group? And the answer is actually very simple, which is that natural selection operates at the group level in addition to the among individuals within groups. And so even though, I think I might have that on the next slide. Let me just check, because even though selfishness beats altruism within groups, to be the solid citizen, to be the cooperator, makes you vulnerable, basically, to individuals and who take but don't give. It's equally true that altruistic groups beat selfish groups. So well-organized groups is going to outcompete less well-organized groups. And so when we think about natural selection operating at the level of groups in addition to individuals within groups, then altruism and groups that work well it's possible to explain them, but it's important to emphasize that there are still opposing forces that take place, because groups will not evolve to function well if there is too much disruptive competition within groups. So group selection has to trump individual level selection in order for groups to function well. And this explains a lot of, why groups often don't function well. And everything I'm saying applies to all scales, from little tiny groups to nations in the global global village. Now, I was very lucky as part of the Evolution Institute to start working with Elinor Ostrom. She's a political science by training, and all her life she passed away in 2012, all her life she studied groups around the world that manage common pool resources. These are resources that must be shared, such as forests, fields, fisheries, and irrigation systems. And they're vulnerable to a problem that's been called the tragedy of the commons. I should have made that one of our questions. How many of you have heard the tragedy of the phrase, the tragedy of the commons? And basically it means that these kinds of resources are prone to over-exploitation, because it's to an individual's advantage to take more than their share, basically, even if it degrades the common resource. And what Lynn Ostrom showed empirically by actually studying these groups is that they're actually capable of managing their own affairs, avoiding the tragedy of the commons, but only if they possess certain core design principles. And the idea that these groups can manage their resources was so against received economic wisdom that she was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2009. Economic wisdom held that the only way to avoid the tragedy of the commons was either to privatize the resource if possible, or to regulate it top-down in a top-down fashion. So the fact that these groups were capable of functioning well and managing their own affairs, avoiding the tragedy of the commons, that new, so new that she won the Nobel Prize in 2009. And then I was lucky to work with Lynn for several years before her death, and her associate Michael Cox. And we wrote a paper that generalizes the core design principles. What does that mean? It means that all groups that that basically this problem is a very general problem. It applies not just to a certain kind of human group, but it applies to all social species. And for that reason, it applies to most human groups. What is it about all of the groups that we're working with? We're all trying to work together to achieve some common goals, and we're faced with a common set of problems. One is we need to coordinate appropriate action for the task at hand. We need to do the right things. We need to suppress disruptive self-serving behaviors within the group. And we also need to avoid interference and cultivate appropriate relations with other groups. This term multi-level selection basically takes note of the fact that we live in groups within groups within groups, a multi-tier hierarchy. And so, small groups operate within a city or a town, and the town operates within a province or a state, and so on and so forth. And these basic principles hold, they're scale independent. They hold at all scales of this multi-scale hierarchy. And so with this briefest of introductions, without further ado, I'm now going to tell you the core design principles for the efficacy of groups. This is very, very useful information. But on the other hand, you won't be surprised, because these principles, as I will get to, are in fact very intuitive. Very important and very intuitive. So here we go. Number one, the groups that work have a strong identity and sense of purpose. If you don't know what your group is, who's in it, and what it's supposed to do, your group is unlikely to work very well. Number two, there needs to be proportional equivalence of costs and benefits. That means it's not sustainable for some people to do most of the work and for other people to get most of the benefits. There has to be some matching, basically. It doesn't have to be even. Some people can do more of the work, but their benefits have to be proportional. And not just financial benefits, but often social recognition benefits, so that people can be credited for what they do. Number three, consensus decision-making. Decision-making, of course, deciding what the group is going to do, is an opportunity for unfairness. So if some people are making decisions and other people are cut out of the decision-making process, then this is a recipe for unfairness. Decision-making doesn't necessarily need to be by strict consensus, because that can be cumbersome. There's a trade-off between a consensus decision-making process is often quite inefficient. But whatever the decision-making process is, it needs to be transparent, and there has to be enough input so that this does not become an opportunity for unfairness. The groups that work monitor behavior. So if it's possible to misbehave, to behave in ways that are not agreed upon, and to get away with it so that it's not detected, then of course that's a recipe for unfairness. So the groups that work have a way of monitoring agreed upon behaviors. What happens when somebody is out of step? Well, there has to be some way to correct it, and that doesn't have to be mean or harsh. Often people are trying to do the right thing, and when they fail, it's not because they're malintentioned. And so a friendly reminder is often enough to keep people in solid citizen mode, but not always. And so there needs to be a way to ramp up the sanctions, basically to escalate the sanctions in cases where it's necessary. Religions are very good at this, and exclusion is always something that religions have as an option, basically, if they can't resolve a conflict. Number six, a fast, fair conflict resolution. In a lot of groups, they start out small and everyone's cooperating. It seems like there's never going to be any conflict, but of course there will be, especially if the group becomes large. And so there has to be a way to resolve conflicts in a way that's fast, so it's not protracted, and is perceived as fair by both parties. And this is Also, you see in a lot of traditional societies, it might be a council of elders or respected people who are respected by everyone in the group, who are entrusted with resolving the conflict. For a group to manage its affairs, then it needs to have elbow room, basically. It needs to be able to manage its affairs. And so often, especially in modern times, that's not the case. That groups are dictated from above or from without. They're being bossed around, and they're not unable to organize themselves as they would like. And then finally, because this is multi-scalar, scale independent, then everything that I've said about the organization of a group applies to the organization of a multi-group population, a group that exists in an ecosystem of other groups. And that's Ostrom called that polycentric governance. And so there you have it. These are the ingredients that make groups function well. And now let me make a few observations about them. One is they're very intuitive. I bet you weren't surprised. And we'll see from your comment. So isn't it strange that these are all familiar? We can all nod our heads as we go through them. And at the same time, and some groups adopt them without requiring coaching, don't need to be taught. And that means that some change methods have converged upon them. I'll bet that the participants here are familiar with some change methods. One, for example, would be ABCD, asset-based community development, and has a lot of these ingredients. And yet, despite this, these design features are sadly lacking from many groups and change methods. Some groups do them, but not all groups do. So why don't more groups employ the design principles? One is that there's conflicts of interest within a group. In many groups, there's people that want to get their way, often in a very well-meaning sense, but they want to stage manage. And so there's opposing pressures. There's two ways to succeed, basically, as a group or at the expense of other members of your group. And so one reason why these design principles don't exist is that the disruptive within-group processes have had their way. Likewise for conflicts of interest in a multi-group environment. But a third reason, which I think is a little bit more subtle, therefore worth discussing, is this idea of competing narratives, basically. And so much the narrative that we have, the theory, the narrative, the worldview, determines what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And in our culture, more in America than in Canada, but still plenty in Canada, there's very much a competing narrative, which is mainstream economics, envisions people as purely selfish, as the only way that you can do economic policy is appealing to selfish interests and so on and so forth, which basically does not have those design principles in mind. So simply changing the narrative and thinking about this from an evolutionary perspective can actually cause some things to make sense that did not make sense before. So the way our world views, the way we think about the world, in our groups, make a huge difference in what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. A few more observations. These design principles are a little bit like the organs of your body. You have many organs, and if I remove a single one of them, you would die. This is not additive. And so it seems that we should be having all of these design principles, and that if you were to remove a single one, such as monitoring, then that could be, if not fatal, could severely compromise a group. Now, another important point that Lynn Ostrom made was that although this is a blueprint or a recipe of sorts, it cannot be applied in a cookie-cutter fashion. These are functional design principles, but how you implement those functions is highly local and contextual. So monitoring, all groups need to monitor, but how they monitor can really depend, and it's up to the group to figure out the best way to do that. So there's a lot of tweaking that the group has to do in order to implement these design principles. They cannot be implemented in a cookie-cutter fashion. I should also say, although it's not on the slide, that these are just core design principles, any particular group with a particular agenda is going to have additional design principles, auxiliary design principles, and those are just as important as the core design principles. But you do need, most groups do need the core. Now, how general are these design principles? For the last 5 or 6 years, I've been studying these design principles in neighborhood schools, businesses, churches, and intentional communities, either in my hometown in actual groups or with studies, basically surveys of many groups. Let me just flash through these. I think that they'll be quite similar to some of the projects that are part of the CED. We have some neighborhood projects. This is called Design Your Own Park, in which we used the creation of local neighborhood parks as a neighborhood empowerment device. And so, and then this became truly a common resource. And in the process of creating the park, then we tried to help the neighborhood groups implement the design principles for everything that they do. Independently of me, a man named Roy Okerson, who trained under Ostrom, did the same thing in Buffalo, New York, in a neighborhood in Richmond Avenue, and I had the opportunity to visit him last year in Buffalo, and just wonderful examples of here's a cooperatively owned business, garden center that was just thriving. The neighborhoods were beautiful. People were taking good care of their homes. All this great landscaping was taking place. It was very inspirational. I had the opportunity to work with my public school district to create a program for at-risk youth called the Regents Academy. And here, just think about the design principles in the context of a school environment, and especially from the standpoint of a at-risk student. You know, how many of these students think of their, have a strong sense of identity and purpose for going to school? Just run down the list, and you'll see that that these design principles can be sadly lacking in the experience of a student, at least in America, and especially a student that's not thriving within the school. Although I should mention that the school works great for some people. And when it does work great, I'll bet it's for these reasons. So it's not as if all schools are lacking these design principles. Some are, from the standpoint of some students. And when we created a program for at-risk students in which we built in these design principles, guess what? They thrived, and within the first year, their performance improved greatly. In a randomized control trial, which means that we had a comparison group composed of the very same kinds of students who had the normal high school routine, so we could scientifically demonstrate the efficacy of this program. We're doing a study of benefit corporations. So this is a movement, mostly in the United States. There's a company called B-Lab, which has become certifies other companies. They submit information to B-Lab, and then B-Lab gives them a score, and if their score is sufficiently high, then they can advertise themselves as socially accountable, responsible companies. And so we've been studying these B corporations, which incidentally tend to work very well as businesses. So not only are they doing good, but they're also doing well as businesses. And we're studying them to see, is the reason that they're doing both good and well, is it because they've incorporated these design principles? And for the most part, it seems to be the case that the design principles are behind these well-functioning companies in the same way that they're behind the common pool resource groups that Elinor Ostrom studied. We're also doing a survey of intentional communities. These are like eco-villages and what used to be called communes. There's many hundreds of them. They exist in a federation or a fellowship, and we've done a survey with over 100 of these communities. And they also seem to work when they work, when they work, and they don't always. It's in part because they have implemented these design principles. So here's just a little interim summary. We have an approach that provides a blueprint for improving the efficacy of groups. It has a very strong scientific theoretical foundation. We're accumulating empirical support for it, and we think it's relevant to nearly any group whose members must work together to achieve common goals. I have just a few more minutes, and we can turn to the question and answer period. And so the next challenge is to make this approach available to as many groups as possible. When I get involved in groups, it's very time-consuming, and I can only work with a few groups at a time. And so we really wanted to create something that would make this available to an unlimited number of groups. And at the same time, we wanted to continue to function as scientists and to study group efficacy scientifically with the groups that we work with in a practical sense. And so over a number of years, and with a development team that includes Alan Honek, who's a documentary filmmaker, among his other accomplishments, we've created something called PROSOCIAL, which is a practical framework for increasing the efficacy of groups, a scientific database. What it is an internet platform and a network of facilitators that can potentially reach an unlimited number of groups. And so the way it works is that every group who wants to get involved is presented with a website to facilitate their interaction. You might be familiar with meetup.com, or you might work with software applications like Basecamp, which are basically ways to facilitate groups. And the group will also take an online course that members step through together. And it's here where they both learn about the design principles and assess themselves with respect to the design principles. Each step takes a relatively short amount of time. There's a time step, amount of time provided, so that even a busy person can do their homework, basically. And then if you take 3 days as a time step, then the course is completed in about 3 weeks. And what they do is they reflect upon the purpose and values of the group. That was design principle 1. They evaluate the group with respect to their core design principles. And then they end up by evaluating short-term goals that they could actually measure to assess their own efficacy. And then this is intended to be repeated annually so that the groups stay with the program. The first part about reflecting upon the purpose of the group is a really interesting exercise that's borrowed from the therapeutic literature, mindfulness-based therapy. And very briefly, we use this little schematic here, which consists of 4 quadrants. And in the lower half, it's mental things that take place in your head. In the upper half, it's actions that take place in the world. On the right half, it's the actions and the mental thoughts and feelings that take you towards your valued goals. And on the left half, it's the mental and actions that take you away from your valued goals. And what the group does, what members of the group does as part of the process before they actually get to the design principles, is work through these 4 quadrants, so that they begin in the lower right quadrant and to reflect upon, why are we in this group? What is it? What's it for? Not just superficially, but what are the values that we're trying to express with this thing that we're doing? And then moving into the left-hand lower quadrant, even though this is a valuable, worth our time to be in this group, why is it hard to achieve these goals? What are some of the things that get in the way? And lots of stuff kind of surfaces here. Now we move up into the upper left quadrant. Or what are some of the actions that these things that get in the way cause us to do that actually take us away from what we want to do? And finally, what is it that we can do in order to work towards our valued goals? And then you end up in the center, so that after having gone through this exercise, you now, as you review the things that you're doing, you can locate them in this space. And there's a large literature showing that when individuals do this as a therapeutic exercise, it increases their psychological flexibility and actually helps them work towards their valued goals. And what we've done is we've modified this so that a group can do the same thing. And so I think this is quite interesting and is an important part of what we offer. Well, at the end of it all, we get our 8 design principles, and we visualize it this way, as a wheel, basically, so that if your group was implementing all of the design principles well, it would roll along smoothly as a group. But actually, your group is something like that irregular polygon within the wheel, and that makes for a pretty bumpy ride. So one of the things that this exercise does is cause you to improve upon the design principles after you've assessed them for your group. And then finally, this is a common business practice and one which is worth emulating, is that any group really should have its long-term goals in mind. That's sometimes called true north. That's reflected in your positive values for the group. But then in addition, there needs to be the next steps, the thing that you're actually going to realize in the foreseeable future. You need to clarify those and that they should be quantified. We're going to do this in this time period, and we're going to measure it to the extent possible. So then you could actually have your to-do list. You can allocate responsibility, which is part of design principle 2, equal costs and benefits, and you could really get things done in a much more professional fashion than perhaps you are already. So that's a quick description of ProSocial. The timetable is we're just about to launch. This is a big job, and so I'm a little frustrated we haven't launched already. But we think that we're ready for our what we call a soft launch. Groups can already sign up and to learn more about it by visiting prosocialgroups.org. This is free of charge. We want this to be like Facebook, basically. We want to enlist as many groups as possible. And we think it's best to start small. We're starting. We know that there'll be a learning curve for ourselves. And so I think that if you're in a position to start, and if you're an organization, if you're a very small group, then just please, everyone sign up and do it as a group. If you're a larger group, and you have subgroups, then we recommend that you start with a subgroup, a committee of some sort, and then let them go through the process, and then scale up on the basis of the experience. Although it's free, it's important for there to be commitment, basically. And so the group that does this has to really decide that we're going to go through this process together. They're going to commit on spending the time to do it, and this will amply repay itself. But the strongest groups are the ones that commit to actually working on behalf of the group, and that's true of this of ProSocial. And so I encourage you to join our grand experiment in social organization, and now I declare this meeting open for discussion.
Super. Thank you very much, David. That's a really fascinating story and background, and a very interesting new tool and approach that you've created. Yes, I was just going to say Bingham had posted there who should start, and I think you answered his question there in your second last slide in terms of starting small in an organization with some key stakeholders or subgroup, and then scaling up from there. So let me just change the slide here. It's the Q&A section of our webinar now. So what I'll do is I'm going to unsync the presentation so that people can go back and through, have a look at some of those slides that might have gone by too quickly. If you want to have another look at those design principles, and everyone can invite, you can post questions or other comments you have here in the chat box. And let's
if I could jump in on Bingham's question. Of course, if it's a small group, then the whole group can do it. We think up to about a dozen is manageable. If it's a larger group than that, then it's very important for the group that does it to be representative. As you can see, that so many of these design principles are about fairness and inclusiveness and transparency. And so if you were to have a subgroup do it and it wasn't representative, then right away some people would say, I'm not represented in this, therefore, I'm alienated. So the group that does it must be representative, and then what they do, their conversation, must be made accessible to the rest of the group.
Very interesting. Yeah, I was going to mention that the idea of fairness jumped out to me as underlying a number of those core design principles, and related to Begum's question about who should be involved. Many of our members are organizations themselves, and some of them might have, for example, neighborhood residents or client group members involved on the board of directors or involved in the governance of the organization, but I think the question of who the organization seeks to represent and how strong that engagement is can really be uncovered in some ways through this the process, and making sure, as you say, David, that all of the different groups that seek to be involved or assumed to be represented by an organization are actually involved in this process.
Absolutely. I've been through it twice. I designed it with my development team, and then the development team went through it. And you'd think that we wouldn't get much out of it because we built the damn thing, right? So but the fact was, going through it was amazing to me, the experience of going through it, especially the matrix. And then I went through it with the steering committee for the Binghamton Neighbourhood Project, which are faculty members at Binghamton University. That was also a powerful experience, but quite a different one, because that problem surfaced with going through the matrix in the lower left quadrant about really, why this group wasn't working very well, despite the fact that we were a small group and well-meaning and so on and so forth. There were real problems that surfaced by going through the matrix, and so I think that the experience of having gone through it myself makes me especially impressed, basically, by it as a method.
Interesting. We have another question from Begum, and I just want to skip to Laura's question first, because one of the other points you made, David, was the idea of changing the narrative, and I think that is something that is really fundamental that we come up time and again against as we suggest different corporate models or other ways of thinking about the economy and society, that competing with the dominant narrative is constantly a challenge in the way it's embedded into our thinking. Laura's question, have you noticed any design principles that are particularly challenging for us in a North American cultural context?
Well, I think that the whole narrative of individualism is, well, there's more than one. I mean, these are complicated questions. So I think that there's actually an interesting balance that Elinor Ostrom is often a favorite of Tea Party activists because she's basically, she argues for the autonomy of small groups, and that's like, getting big government off our backs and things like that. But at the same time, although groups need to have elbow room, individuals within groups are very highly regulated. An individual can't do whatever they want within a group. That's what the design principles are all about. I like to say that small groups are the most highly regulated groups in the world are small groups. It's just so spontaneous that we don't think about it that way. And by the same token, although small groups need autonomy, they also need to be connected. It's a multi-group world. And so the idea of polycentric governance is just very, very new against the background of received economics. She deserved that Nobel Prize. So I think that these ideas are very contrary to received economic thinking. At the same time, for those people that are into cooperatives, and I suspect most of your members are, then they're very friendly, basically, very conducive to the way that we're already thinking. And I think they kind of add ammunition to the way that we're already inclined to think.
I guess related to that, in fact, Begum's second question there, you'd mentioned that disruptive self-serving behaviors require suppressing, but sometimes such behaviors develop or result from exclusion or some of the dominant narrative or dominant practices that are out there. Do you have any tips, I guess, or suggestions, he says, to address this, or how we can try to help change some of those behaviors?
Let's see, which question is that? I want to make sure that I have the
Sure. So Begum said you'd suggested that disruptive self-serving behaviors require suppressing. It's just, I think it's the third one from the bottom in the chat box there.
All right.
Sometimes such behaviors manifest as a result of exclusion. How would you address that?
Right. Well, I think that this is why it's important to clarify the identity and sense of purpose of the group, that we know that we are a group, what we're doing, that we have a strong group identity, and that we are a member of the group. I think that if you do that, and also that there's norms of behavior, and when all that becomes clarified, then I think that it's pretty clear what counts as deviant and normative behavior. And then most people are pretty eager, if they're going to be in the group, to do that. So a lot of the design principles contribute to that.
And I wonder, well, specifically the principle around graduated sanctions. So if you have a behavior that is not conducive to the group or is in violation of some of the other design principles, then I think the point you made earlier on, that most people are trying to participate constructively and doing their best, and just sort of that the first level of sanction being a supportive kind of response to help people change those behaviors is, and then further on, if it becomes repeated or the sanctions move up as change doesn't seem to work, I suppose. But that it seems to me that the graduated sanction principle is key to trying to keep a check on those behaviors.
Yeah, and some of this, the general rule is abundant praise for good behavior and mild punishment for bad behavior that escalates when necessary. That's a general rule for social groups. And some of the ways the internet platform is designed to do this, it was amusing to see this in action when I went through the process. For one thing, we ask you, there's a statement that you sign at the beginning that says, I commit to going through these steps with the other members of my group. And just signing your name to something like this is a public, basically, commitment to actually participate in the group. Then because the group does step through it together on any particular step, they're providing their input. And if somebody isn't doing it, it's public knowledge. and it's just like they feel guilty. And they apologize for it and so on, and that's quite different than if you don't have these mechanisms in place. And I mean, I'm sure that most of your members have the experience where you're trying to get everyone to contribute to a discussion, for example, and only a very small fraction of people do. But here you're obligated. Everyone needs to provide their input, and if they don't, they're not following through on what they said that they would do. So it's kind of baked into the process, equal participation.
Very interesting. Yep. Yvonne mentioned that he's familiar with groups in India that have been, I'm not sure if it's similar to the intentional communities process there. I can't remember the name. I think he's mentioned it before, but that have put similar principles into place over 40 years, and it's 11,000 villages. Are you familiar with internationally other large-scale sort of implementations of similar principles?
I am not familiar with that one, and I would like Yvonne to send me a reference if possible. I do want to make the point, and it's so interesting to me that when Ostrom studied these common pool resource groups, she found that they varied. Some exhibited these principles without needing to be told, and others were disasters. It was that variation that enabled her to derive the principles in the first place. And I find that in sector after sector, I find the same thing. Some groups work great because they implement these design principles. No one had to teach them. They would say, tell me something new, right? They're already doing it. And yet other groups are sadly lacking. That's what you will find. And so the fact that there's these groups in India that are doing it well, that's awesome in the first place. And I want to know about it. And I also want to spread it. One of the exciting things about what we're creating is that it provides the ability for groups to communicate with other groups, not just to communicate with us or to organize their own affairs. And that means, for example, if you're a multi-group organization, then you can basically start multiple groups and then communicate among groups. You can build up the polycentric organization however you like. So the multi-group aspect is something that I'm looking forward to developing.
Fabulous. Well, I'll make sure Yvonne shares the name of that group. I think it's ASAFE, but we can find the full link and community forestry groups in Nepal as well.
Let me take an opportunity to publicize a recent documentary that Alan did, and Alan Honek, who's in the chat room. He did a documentary of something that happened in one of the American Northwest forests, which took a situation in which the Forestry Service, with the logging industry, basically was just totally opposed to the environmental interests, and turned it into much more of a cooperative, symbiotic situation in which these various interests were working together in a sustainable fashion. We hope this will become a model for other areas in America. And as Alan was filming this documentary, he was telling me this is like a case study of the Ostrom design principles being implemented in this case, and no one thought of it that way. But that is what was happening, was that they were building a group of stakeholders which were exhibiting the Ostrom design principles. So it was fascinating for Alan to be participating in PROSOCIAL and shooting this documentary at the same time.
What was the name? Did you say the documentary is available now? Or?
It is available now. Alan, type in the name of the documentary.
Mm-hmm. Super. Yeah, we could, learning from those other experiences, I think really helps it make it real for people. And so, as you say, the PROSOCIAL platform connecting groups, grappling with the changes. And as you also mentioned, each of those principles is contextual, so it gets applied differently. And so learning for what's worked or how other people have adapted and applied some of those design principles, I think, would be very helpful for people on the ground. That comes to Laura's second question there. Any key common practices among groups that apply the principles well? I don't know if you can think about commonalities among the groups that, for whom it comes instinctively, that you mentioned. Some people intuitively understand that and apply the principles well.
Well, I think that again, the commonalities are the principles themselves, but the implementations are where things get diverse. And I'm not sure that there's many commonalities. I mean, the thing to stress there, let me just do it again. Hopefully, I'm not just being too redundant. That when it comes to functional design principles, there's commonalities. All groups need these principles. When it comes to implementation, there's many ways to skin a cat. Is the thing that you want to say. And now there'll be some transfer. The best practices for some groups will be also best practices for other groups. That's why you want to have communication among groups, basically, so that they can share best practices, especially within a sector, so that schools, for example, can communicate with each other. So this worked in my school. How about your school, basically, is the kind of thing that can take place. And by the way, all of this is cultural evolution. I haven't said it, but that's what it is. And in order for cultural evolution to happen, there must be variation, people doing different things, and there must be selection according to certain criteria. And one of the things I've noticed is that actually an essay that I can, I'll give you the link. It's called The Paradox of Practices That Work But Don't Spread. The world is full of practices that work, but they're not copied, because copying involves all kinds of stuff is required to copy. You have to compare, you have to loads of stuff. So in fact, the Regents Academy, this successful school program, no longer exists. It worked, but it didn't spread and didn't even survive. So there's a lot that's required for cultural evolution to take place. And we think of PROSOCIAL as a multi-group platform, as something which can actually create an efficient process of cultural evolution so that best practices can spread.
I think that would resonate with a lot of what our members are doing and the ideas of innovative practices that they're designing or looking to adapt. That's fabulous. You mentioned also, I think related to that comment, in your presentation that there are auxiliary, in addition to the core design principles, there are auxiliary design principles that different groups would use based on their particular situation. Can you give maybe an example of one of those to illustrate how that might be an important addition?
Yeah, sure. And I think that it's important to say this because there's many group improvement methods. And if you're actually in a group, and most of your members are, you know that there's lots and lots of structure that has to take place. When I started the Evolution Institute, it started out with just 2 people, and then it grew into a proper institution. And then it's at that point that we realized the structure that we needed in order to function efficiently as a group. And so in some ways, those are the auxiliary design principles. But 3 that I can just list right off the bat is that in some groups there's a lot of turnover of members. And so there's a constraint that somehow the group has to maintain its organization even though the individuals are coming and going. And so you're going to have some design principles in order to cope with that, basically. How do you orient the people coming in so that the group, in a sense, can have a structure even as the individuals come and go. So those aren't part of the core design principles. And in fact, the common pool resource groups that Lynn Ostrom studied were not like that. Typically, those were members that were in it for the long haul. With our school group, we had 2 auxiliary design principles. The first one noted that nobody learns when all of the benefits are in the far future and all of the costs are in the present. And learning outcomes are typically of that sort. You're trying to get people to learn things that are going to benefit them, like, by giving them a good job. But it's a drag on a day-by-day basis. Well, nobody learns like that. And so you have to make long-term learning outcomes enjoyable and rewarding over the short term, okay? Any school group will need to do that. And secondly, fear is not an atmosphere conducive to learning. So if you want to have genuine learning take place, you need to have a safe and secure social environment. School has to be fun. You have to feel safe in order for learning to take place. And so that's not a core design principle, but it's a very important in a school context, especially for at-risk students who are threatened all the time outside of school. So we added 2 auxiliary design principles to the school program, and actually the third one as well, because we had such turnover. We had 4 principles in 3 years that we had to orient. So the students, of course, are coming and going, and the staff is coming and going, and somehow the group organization has to stay the same in the face of massive turnover. Very difficult. Very interesting.
We're just about out of time. I want to ask you one last question because I think in a previous presentation I saw some work you'd done around mapping prosociality, and it seemed to me at the time to be a really interesting application, kind of a measure of community capacity and well-being to identify sort of more at-risk or well-functioning neighborhoods. Have you done any more work on that, or is that still a potential application of some of the ideas behind prosocial?
Yeah, that's a great application. And basically, if you're in a position to do that, like working with a city or with a school or something like that, where you can get the information, then you can create a map of prosociality on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood basis, which will more or less indicate the groups that are working well and those that are working poorly. And a city really needs this kind of information structure. I say that a city needs a brain, basically, a way of processing and perceiving information. And there's a lot of movements along those lines, including big cities like Boston and so on. So that's a little bit of a different topic, although very closely related, how do you take this kind of approach at a citywide scale, basically. With prosocial, what we're doing is at a group-wide scale.
Yep, very interesting. No, and I think the ideas behind the measures, right, of the ability to cooperate and take action builds on older notions of social capital and really anyways, it seems to me is a very potentially powerful tool that would be of interest to our members.
That's right. There's a lot of overlap with the concept of social capital, bowling alone, and all that. So a lot of overlap with some of these academic traditions. Well, let me just close by saying that if you want to continue the conversation, there's a number of ways to do it, but the very best way is to basically sign up for PROSOCIAL. And then we'll have, you'll basically establish a communication link with myself and my colleagues and with other groups, and you can participate in my grand experiment in social organization.
Excellent. And so I think we have the link there, prosocialgroups.org, as well as a couple other articles that for additional or resources for additional information. If you'd like to also learn out more about the organizations or presenters, follow those links. And if you want to stay in touch on CED-related issues, check out the CCEDNet website or sign up for our free email newsletters. Participants also should have received an email with a link to a 1-minute evaluation survey trying to implement the design principle or the monitoring principle, design principle here. And so we want your feedback in terms of how you thought about this webinar. If you can take a second or a few seconds to fill it out right now, it's really short and your feedback is important to us. So once again, many thanks to David for sharing this unique perspective and really, I think, groundbreaking and important work for us. And thanks to all the participants for the questions and participation. The webinar recording will be posted on our website in the coming days, and we'll send everyone a link as soon as it's available. Once again, I'm just going to unsync the presentation so that people on the webinar can scroll through the presentation and review slides. And for the time being, I'll say thanks again to David.